share your screen with your audience. You can click the button. Okay, I think I'm live. All right, so I know I am just a few minutes behind schedule, but this was my first time and I wanted to make sure that everything was working well. So I'm excited. Okay, let me see something here because, okay. Let me fix my necklace. All right. Oh, this is so exciting because if this feels good, then I'm going to continue to do this more often. So, excited to do this. All right. All right. Let me get my setup going here. All right. Here we go. All right, guys. So, welcome. Welcome to the Power of Women's Collective Wealth. I am Marjorie Bostwick Phoenix. And this is going to be a little bit different. If any of you have attended any of my previous saloons, I had 3 saloons. And this is going to be a little bit more casual and a little bit more expensive, right? I want you to forget everything that you were taught about how the world works when it comes to money, right? Just push all of that aside for a moment. And I want you to look through this with a different set of eyes, right? A curious eyes, a fresh set of eyes, because if you don't, you will miss the power of what I'm about to share with you. Now, this is going to be a space for dangerous imagination, right? One of the key elements required to build outside of the system is the willingness to hold bold ideas and not safe ones. And there's a difference. And the reason why dangerous ideas or dangerous imagination is at the heart of the femininity is because it pushes us beyond the constraints of what we've been told is possible, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm done living inside someone else's dream or about what my life should be or what my role as a woman should look like. I believe that our collective vision can transform the world. And I believe that our collective wealth can change narratives and shift economies. So today I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey, right? And I'm going to ask a few questions. I have a couple of prompts for you. You're going to hear me use words like sovereign wealth and shared prosperity and desire. And yes, I know what you're thinking, like, what does desire have to do with collective wealth? More than you realize, all right? So we'll get there. But last week I posted a video called Your Financial Power Outweighs Your Voting Power. And now I'm not saying that your vote is useless. I'm saying to consider the power of collective wealth alongside it. Because every policy and every political move and every system that touches your life is driven by money first, right? And so in that video, I talk about how we can think deeper about what becomes possible when women decide to build wealth together. So that's what we're going to do here today. We're also here because out of the 3 saloons that I have held space for, we were calling in our ancestors and calling in the blueprints that they've left for us, the dangerous dreaming and the building together. We didn't get a chance to touch on the topic. And it is, one of the most important topics, I believe, for us to be women who are evolved and resourced and building together. But before we get any deeper into this topic, I do want to hear from you. right? Um, the chat is open for you. And even if you're watching the recording, please do leave your input into the chat. But I want you to think about this. If money was not a barrier and you could not fail, what is the one bold thing you would build or you would fund with other women if you had collective resources behind you? All right. So, this is the opportunity to dream boldly and dangerously. And I want to be clear when I say dangerous imagination, right? Because if this is your first time hearing me say this, um, these are the types of ideas, right, that the system can't hold, it can't contain, right? And this isn't just about business, this is about how you live your entire life, how you move in the world, right? So that's how I really want you to think when you're doing dangerous imagination, to think about it in that respect. But for this question, if money was not a barrier and you couldn't fail, what is the one bold thing that you would build or fund with other women if you had collective resources behind you? Okay. So just put that in the chat and leave that there for me. I cannot wait to see your answers. Okay. Because I know many of us are holding on to bold ideas, right? But excuse me, we either won't move on them out of doubt or fear, or we can't move on them because of lack of support and resources. And I don't want that to be our story, right? Excuse me while I get a drink of water. So let me share with you what I would fund. Okay. In fact, I put a proposal together last year and I submitted it to an investor for a micro community for women over 40 who are single and want to stay single and live in community with other women, other evolved, resourced women. This would be an eco conscious co housing model that really focuses and nurtures wellness, entrepreneurship, and collective care, right? These women would be building together as a unit, right? Whether they're building ideas or they're just building in their community around them. And I named it Zamani. And I found that from a Swahili word meaning the past that is still present. The community would honor ancestral wisdom, right? While shaping a future grounded in wholeness and collective collectivism and stewardship, right? This is something that real estate developers or property managers, they do not care about the environment that holds these women. They just want to put up these boxes, get you in them, and they care about that rent at the first of the month, right? But even that process looks differently when we control the funding of it, right? So, what's going to help us with this and really grounding us and this type of bold thinking is, let's look back at what history has shown us, right? And I want to go back as far as the 13th to 15th century in the begins, right? This is, and I talked a lot about this era a few months ago in one of my videos titled The Great Remembering, Restoring the Balance of Power in a Changing World. I believe that era was called The Begins or The Begines. I want to say The Begines, but um, I don't. You can correct me in the chat if you want. But this really focused on women in Europe, right? These women formed really intentional communities and they built their own economic infrastructure and they cared for the most vulnerable in the community. They operated entirely outside of the male controlled systems. They pooled their resources, they shared property, and they built institutions together. So they created a sovereign wealth together. Now, some historians call this matriarchal, but what it really was, they actually built something that was closer to a gynarchy. And this is where a gynarchy is where women are governing themselves, right? Entirely outside of a male controlled system. And if you know that history of that time, you know that that was around the beginning of the Inquisition, right? There was persecution of women because they were operating outside of the church and male authority, right? And it's no coincidence that the suppression of the women during that time and the rise of the Inquisition was happening in the same era, right? So it shows you that when women build power outside of a male controlled system, the system will respond, right? And we're actually living inside of that as a result of that. But here's what they can't destroy, or they couldn't destroy, it's the knowledge that was possible, right? The memory that women have already done this. This is nothing new, right? You cannot erase the blueprint. And this is why, when I began the Saloon series, I began this conversation by remembering the blueprints of our ancestors, right? And in our third saloon, we move through and activate. We move through a process of excavation so that we can activate those blueprints that are in all of us, right? So we look back at the models that were left behind for us, right? For what I believe is for this very moment in history, looking at how Harriet Tubman moved and what the risks that Ida B. Wells took, but also looking at our grandmamas, right? And what they did and how they moved and navigated the world, and what my mother did and your mother, right? And this is why I call this time the Great Remembering, because women must remember who they are in order to free themselves of the colonization of our minds. And the difference between then and now is that we actually have the ability to connect with one another across distance. Our communication capacity has grown, right? Now we can find each other easily. We can gather together. We can build with intention and with this full knowledge of what has come before us. So even though they suppressed it then, and they're trying to suppress it now because it is powerful, that same power is still in us. They can't get rid of that. That is still ours. And we hold that in the remembering of it and the activation of it. Now, the remembering didn't stop just in Europe, right? Now it's happening in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, right? Women were building the same sort of power, but under different names and different languages, right? And there's one that we're going to look at that the economists, they eventually give it a formal name, and it's called a ROSCA, ROSCA, which is a rotating savings and credit association. But let me tell you about the way this began. This began when a group of women agreed that they were going to have a fixed amount of money to contribute regularly, like in a pot. And each cycle, one woman receives the full pot, and it rotates until every woman has had her turn. No bank, no credit check, no interest, no contracts, just women in covenant with each other and using their word as the only collateral. Now, this went across different countries because it worked. And it worked because it was built on something that the system, like formal banking systems, has never been able to replicate, and that's trust. And the evolution of this is actually found in examples, like a formal structure of this. We can find this now in Kenya in something called the Chama model, right? It's evolved beyond just a simple savings um, rotation into a collective investment vehicle. Women's chamas are now buying land and funding businesses and investing in real estate and building community infrastructure. And some chamas have grown into registered investment groups. They're managing millions of dollars in assets. And it's gotten to the point that in Kenya, the government has had to create a formal policy around them because they've become too economically significant for them to ignore. And then in India, there is the chit fund system that manages, I think, billions of dollars annually, right? And this is where women in rural communities with no access to formal banking have used chit funds to sort of fund businesses and pay for education and build generational assets. Now, this might sound familiar, right? This might sound familiar because you may know it as another name, as a susu, right? Susus originated in West Africa and it's gone throughout the diaspora. My mother was in a susu. Right? I remember as a child, grew up in the Bahamas, right? My mom was a stay-at-home mom and she was an entrepreneur. She did hair in the kitchen. She baked bread on Friday. She cooked meals on the weekends, right? And this is how she made her extra change. But I watched this as a child and I didn't understand then what I was witnessing. I thought it was just something that women did. But I didn't know that I was actually watching a parallel economy in action. I didn't know that I was watching a living example of what collective wealth actually looks like when women trust each other enough to build together. And that's sort of the independency in a community. And here is why it's a radical thing. Because these sort of susus, this sort of um, um, interdependency, this was created specifically by and for communities that were excluded from formal banking systems. And we know women, right, up until the 70s, couldn't have a credit card, couldn't have their own bank account, right? It's a parallel economy that is still happening today. And to be honest with you, in 2021, I actually was in Asusu myself during COVID. And I was one of the first draws. And it came in handy because it was a difficult time, right? So that's just an example of this. But we can't talk about this either without talking about the history of, here in America, when we look at Black Wall Street, right? In Tulsa, Oklahoma. That was the first example we ever had of a self sustaining Black economy where dollars circulated within that community. And that was built on collective investment, mutual trust, shared vision. Of course, it was destroyed precisely because of how powerful it was. But the difference between the Beguines and us, the women of the 15th, 17th century and us, what happened on Black Wall Street, is not just, resources or technology, it's timing. We're living in a time that is ripe for evolution, and evolution calls for us to live beyond the confines of what has kept us caged. Patriarchy, capitalism, as organizing systems right now are showing their fracture, right? The collapse that we're watching in real time, it is not random, it's timing. And it is what happens when the systems that are extractive, they run out of things to extract. So we're not at risk of being burned at the stake for gathering or communities being burnt down. Well, mostly because most communities are virtual now, right? But that doesn't mean there's no risk. It doesn't mean that there's no risk. It just means that the risk looks different now, but the opportunity is here. So every single one of these models works because of three things: trust, covenant, and collective discipline. Women deciding to be accountable to each other and building from that accountability. And this sovereign wealth fund, at its most basic, right, is just a pool of capital controlled by a specific group, right? And invested for, long-term benefits of that group, right? Like what the Chamas did in Kenya, what they're doing, what Susu has always done, what Black Wall Street represented. Those are like sovereign wealth funds. The difference is those models and what most people call a sovereign wealth fund is not the concept. It's more about the scale of it, right? And the scale is exactly what becomes possible when evolved resource women decide to build together with intent, with intention. So here's another question for you that I want you to think about. And please put that in the chat, your answers in the chat. What do you know of any examples like these of other sort of sovereign wealth funds that have happened in the past that are happening now, right? Other models where women or communities build collective economic power outside of a formal system. So that's one. The other question is that I want you to think about is where in your life or your work are you resourced, but you're not building collectively with others, right? So just drop that in the chat for me. Looking forward to seeing you guys' responses from this. So let's move into desire. I told you at the beginning that we were going to talk about desire, and here is why it matters in this conversation. You can understand every model that I shared with you, right? You can appreciate the stories. But if you have not given yourself permission to desire something bold or different for your own life and for the lives of other women, none of it will mean anything. It won't move into action, right? And what I discovered is that you cannot build wealth, let alone collective wealth, from a colonized body. And I mean that literally. Capitalism and patriarchy is not just shaped the system outside of us. They have gotten inside of us. it has shaped us in many ways, and it has been built on this psychological colonization of women's relationship with their own value. So we carry this as money wounds, right? Stories of lack and scarcity. Those stories live in our bodies and in our nervous system. And it shows up in the way that we freeze when it's time to invest in ourselves, and we shrink our prices, right? In this way that we give our best thinking away for free, right? Because deep down inside, we don't believe it has value. And, I've been guilty of that. We've internalized that so completely that many of us don't even know what we truly desire anymore. We know what we're supposed to want. We know what is realistic. We know what we can justify, but desire, real desire, the bold, unedited, unapologetic version or vision of what we want to build and experience, and how we want to live. Think about that for a moment. Actually feel into that. If your mind and body are still colonized, you will never know what you truly desire. And if you do not know what you desire, you cannot bring your full genius to what you are trying to build, either alone or with others. Because collective wealth is not just about pooling money, it's about pooling desire and our vision and our the boldest versions of what each of us in a room can make possible. You cannot build a sovereign economy from an unsovereign self. So, this is why the work of evolution is not separate from the wealth conversation, it's the foundation of it. All of the saloons have come full circle to this point. Now, what this can look like in practice, and not just as a concept, is something that I've created inside the Feminati. It's a sovereign order that operates as an incubator for women who want to build outside of this fishbowl. This is going to be a rigorously curated space of women gathering to practice collective dangerous imagination and to architect a parallel world and new systems outside of the ones that have taken so much from us. Women gathering to name where the systems are failing, imagining what could replace them, and begin like sketching the blueprints together. Every woman in that space is a contributor. She brings her expertise, her way of thinking, her bold ideas, and the women in the room are the resources. This is cooperative economics in practice. This is like the susu at the highest level. And one of the first ways we're moving into this is that we're going to be prototyping from our Dangerous Imagination Labs, and that's going to be starting in June. We're going to have two women in a pod as midwife and architect. They're taking turns being a midwife and an architect and holding that for each other through their imagination, through their architecting, and the birthing of something different that the world has never seen before. But I want you to understand that this is not a coaching program. This is not a mastermind. This is a sovereign order where evolved, resourced women build the next era together. You're going to have access to high level vetted teachers and experts who will come in every month to deepen your knowledge base on everything that we're looking at. And we're not just looking at this from your business, we're looking at this for your entire life. And now, where the collective wealth comes in that we've been talking about today, that is something that we'll also be actively architecting together. And that is the North Star of all of it. All of it. It's about shared prosperity. When one woman rises, so does another woman. We're rising together. There's nothing like this out there. So the doors for this open on June 9th. But I am accepting applications for founding members to a select group of women through an application and vetting process. Because the quality of what happens inside depends entirely on who is in the room. So, if anything that you heard piques your interest and you want to move beyond what has the confines of what your life has shown you, then I want to invite you in to learn more about the Feminati community. I'm going to leave a link to the interest form in the description box. And that way we can have a conversation, just a conversation. It's not a sales call. I'm going to tell you that right now. Just a conversation to answer any questions and so that you can get more detail. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you will know when the Dangerous Imagination Labs open up if you'd like to participate or just want to and continue to enjoy the content. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm not usually on Sundays. I usually have a video every week that drops on Saturday mornings. So do look out for that. But until next time, I am Marjorie, and this is the work of remembering who you are before the world told you who to be. I'll see you next time.